I will be talking. This evening, I will be talking and being recorded we're talking about the 5 mindfulness trainings. Let me just get this picture. We're talking about 5 mindfulness practices because we're going to have a ceremony in a couple of weeks. And those of you that would like to receive these trainings in a formal ceremony will be invited to participate, join it. So you need to know about it before you can choose if you really would like to participate. And that's what this evening is all about. So for those of you that weren't here last week when we talked about why we do it and what it is, I'll just do a really brief recap. One of the Buddha's first teachings was something called the 5 Precepts. And these came about because some lay people came to him and asked him, basically, how can I live an ethical life? How can I live without contributing to my suffering or anybody else's suffering? And so the Buddha said, well, try this, do this. And the way I heard it at the beginning was that the Buddha said, avoid. And I have seen it written that he said, do not. But for me, that sounds a little bit too much like scripture. So I always go back to avoid. So the Buddha said, avoid killing, avoid lying, avoid sexual misconduct, avoid stealing, and avoid taking in toxins, ingesting toxins. So Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a more modern, secular version of those precepts because it was his thought, his intention to have a Buddhist teaching that would provide a guideline for the way we live now. And so he wrote the 5 mindfulness trainings. They are very much patterned after what the Buddha said, of course. So the first mindfulness training is called Reverence for Life. And the second one is called True Happiness. And this one is happiness about not stealing. The third one is about true love, which has to do with sexual misconduct. The fourth one is called deep listening and loving speech. And that has to do with not telling falsehoods, not lying. And then the last one is Nourishment and Healing, which has to do with paying attention to what we ingest, both the foods that we eat, the things we hear, the things we see, the people we associate with, all of that, the things we read, everything that we ingest with all of our senses, being careful to avoid things that are toxic. So that is what Thich Nhat Hanh meant when he wrote these 5 mindfulness trainings. I'm going to just read one of the things that Thich Nhat Hanh said when he wrote these. He said, my hope is that these mindfulness trainings can represent a Buddhist contribution to a global ethic, a way for the human species to sustain itself in these dangerous and difficult times. That was written in 1985. And unfortunately, we're still in these dangerous and difficult times. So we need this ethic, maybe more than ever. I'd like to know this, the mindfulness teachings are a wide path out of suffering, not necessarily connected with a particular religion. Buddhism was developed as a teaching path rather than a religion. I always like to remember that, especially when someone wants to refer to Buddhism as a religion. I know some people feel that way about it, but I always like to remember that it was developed as a teaching path, not necessarily as a religion. So there are no doctrines. There are no hard and fast things that say, believe this way. And I personally really appreciate that. So what we're going to do tonight is read the 5 mindfulness trainings. We'll have them up on the monitor so that you can see them. And after each one, I want to maybe just give a few comments from Thich Nhat Hanh out of his little book, The Mindfulness Survival Kit, and maybe invite some of you that have taken the 5 to say something about how has your life changed? Was there some part of it that was more challenging than another? Or was it all just easy? So think about that. If you've received the 5 trainings, I would love for you to share as we go along. So Angie, I guess if you would pull, oh, you did already. Okay. All right. So the first mindfulness training. Let's listen to this little introduction. I'll read that, and then Paul is going to read Reverence for Life. The 5 mindfulness trainings represent the Buddhist vision for a global spirituality and ethic. They are a concrete expression of the Buddhist teachings on the 4 Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, the path of right understanding and true love, leading to healing, transformation, and happiness for ourselves and for the world. To practice the 5 mindfulness trainings is to cultivate the insight of interbeing, or right view, which can remove all discrimination, intolerance, anger, fear, and despair. If we live according to the 5 mindfulness trainings, we are already on the path of a bodhisattva. Knowing we are on that path, we're not lost in confusion about our life in the present or in fears about the future. So the first mindfulness training, Reverence for Life.
Reverence for life. Aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life, I am committed to cultivating the insight of interbeing and compassion and learning ways to protect the lives of people, animals, plants, and minerals. I am determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to support any act of killing in the world, in my thinking, or in my way of life. Seeing that harmful actions arise from anger, fear, greed, and intolerance, which in turn come from dualistic and discriminative thinking, I will cultivate openness, non-discrimination, and non-attachment to views in order to transform violence, fanaticism, and dogmatism in myself and in the world.
So one of the things that Ty says about this is that when we practice the first mindfulness training, we strengthen our eyes of inner being. Our look has to be wide and open so that we can see without being caught in ideologies and dogmas. We can see that when we kill someone, we kill ourselves. In fact, I heard there is a verse in the Quran that says pretty much the same thing. Killing one human kills all of humanity. So this is not an uncommon way to look at things. When we meet someone we think of as an enemy, we tend to think that we need to protect ourselves and that hurting the other person will help keep us safe. But hurting another person doesn't keep us safe. We may think the only way to be safe is to attack the other person, but hurting or killing the person we think of as our enemy will only make more enemies. We have to understand our own anger and suffering and help the person we think of as our enemy to alleviate his or her own suffering. Violence can't end suffering. Only understanding and love can transform suffering. I find that really very powerful. Thich Nhat Hanh understands violence, having lived through the Vietnam War, first with the French and then with the Civil War. So, reverence for life. Those of you that have taken the trainings, do you want to say something about this first mindfulness training? Yes, John, please.
Because when I took the transmission, it was all five. So this includes all living beings.
Yeah.
My
Can you
practice.
talk louder?
This includes all living beings in my practice.
Yes.
So if I step on an insect on my kitchen floor, I'm killing a part of myself. If I swat a fly, I'm killing part of myself. So in my practice, laugh at this when I tell this story, but when there were these little insects that were throughout the apartment, I didn't spray, I didn't swat. I bowed in reverence to them and I opened the windows, set them free. Because if I killed them, if I squashed them, I would have killed part of myself.
Thank you, John. John's view is pretty strict according to the guidelines. And it's important to know that these are guidelines. So you may not be able to do what John does. You may not be able to avoid squashing a roach or killing a fly. But that doesn't mean that you don't sort of have a respect for the bug. I heard this story. A person that I know was teaching English as a second language in Japan. And she had an opportunity to go to one of the monasteries there. And she noticed that there were bugs, mostly roaches, some, in the monastery, in the temple. And she asked one of the monks, "What do you do about that?" And he said, "Well, if it gets too annoying, if they're in a place where they shouldn't be, we encourage them to leave. If they don't leave, we be a Buddha." I don't know if that's true, but I like that story. Because I don't think anybody can live up to all of this. And reminder that when we read that first part, it said, if you practice these mindfulness trainings, you're already on the path of a bodhisattva. Bodhisattvas have pretty much impossible tasks to do, but bodhisattvas do not give up. Bodhisattvas do not give in, don't quit, even though it looks pretty astonishing to be able to do any of this. Still, we don't quit. We just keep moving on the path. So if you choose to take this training, you may discover that at first it's very challenging, especially in the part where he says, seeing that harmful actions arise from anger, fear, greed, and intolerance. And then he points out that those come from dualistic and discriminative thinking. I learned that my thinking was very discriminative and probably still is in a lot of ways, but it has changed. And I contributed to this mindfulness training. So my life has definitely changed, and for the better. I don't get nearly as angry as I used to long ago on the highway. So that was a big improvement. Anybody else want to share about this one. Yes, Neil?
Yeah, it's interesting, the dualistic thinking. I like to kind of go into that, but it's sort of kind of us and them. You know, we're all, I say we're all, but I'll just speak for myself, that as an individual, we kind of I care about myself. And as a consequence, when I'm not served a certain way, I could get upset. I recently got upset at a doctor who made me wait an hour and a half. And the good thing was I was able to say that. I didn't suppress it. But if I would have realized the dualistic, like he was doing his job, was a new doctor, on one level, I was proud of myself because he asked me, how you doing? I said, I'm annoyed. He gave me his hand to shake. I didn't shake it. But I let it go. After, you know, I didn't hold on to it. I just let it go. And then we had our interaction. I let him help me and tell him my issue. But still, even that, if I could have been more present to the dualistic, you know, that it's about me. Like you made me wait all this time, and we know doctors do that to us. But yeah, I don't know how. I'm just saying, I have an issue that it's not easy. And then the other note is some people know here, and again, you don't have to do this, but it's just to be mindful. Like I haven't eaten meat or fish in over 30 years. It's just a choice I made. Even before I was aware of Buddhism. You know, you don't have to do it, but it's something to be conscious. You know, as John said, when you swat an animal, do you have a choice? Can you take a minute and open your window? Just something to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. So let's move on to the second one, true happiness. You'll notice that Thai always begins with aware of the suffering caused by something. And then he gives us some guidance about how to overcome that, what to do about it. So somebody out there want to read this? All right, Joshua.
Aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression, I am committed to practicing generosity in my thinking, speaking, and acting. I am determined not to steal and not to possess anything that should belong to others. And I will share my time, energy, and material resources with those who are in need. I will practice looking deeply to see that the happiness and suffering of others are not separate from my own happiness and suffering. That true happiness is not possible without understanding and compassion. And that running after wealth, fame, and power and sensual pleasure can bring much suffering and despair. I'm aware that happiness depends on my mental attitude and not external conditions, and that I can live happily in the present moment simply by remembering that I already have more than enough conditions to be happy. I am committed to practicing right livelihood so that I can help reduce the suffering of living beings on Earth and stop contributing to climate change.
Thank you, Joshua. So all of these things are very comprehensive. And as I said before, there are guidelines, there are ways to practice, a way to begin to practice. In this book, one of the things he says about this practice is we all have an idea about what will make us happy. But if you haven't been able to be happy, maybe it's because you're holding firmly to your idea of happiness. imagine that there are many doors to open to happiness. If you open every door, then happiness has many ways to come to you. Kind of like what we're saying, open wide my heart. When we're open and to happiness, there are many ways that it can come. But if we have this one notion, we're kind of attached to this one idea of what happiness is, then it's very, very difficult for that to manifest. Anybody want to speak to that briefly? Yes, Jody?
It's very true that I have experienced that myself.
Well,
Yeah. I think happiness is a state of mind. That statement is very true, and I have experienced that many times. I may, I am a happy person, and when people see me, and if I tell them something that I've been through, which is kind of difficult, they look at me and they say something like, I would never have guessed. And that's when I tell them that because of what the sessions here and whatever my spiritual path has taught me to just be happy no matter what. In the times of suffering, it is difficult to tap into happiness, but we need to remember that it's a choice. Happiness is a choice. If we choose to be happy, we can be happy. And I personally think that a lot of us who are here today have had suffering. And if we hadn't, we wouldn't be here today. So thanks to all the suffering that has now showed us the path to happiness.
thank you. Yes, this one phrase, I can live happily in the present moment simply by remembering that I already have more than enough conditions to be happy. So we look around us and find something that we're grateful for. That changes everything. Okay, let's read True Love. Paul, do you want to read that one? Let me make a little comment first. This mindfulness training was recently revised. It took more than a year with input from different sanghas all over the world, the Dharma teachers, but it is changed because it no longer reflected the reality of our modern life. And so this is a new version of True Love. One moment. Well, we can listen while we go. Oh, okay.
Aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I am committed to cultivating responsibility and learning ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. Knowing that sexual desire is not love, and that sexual activity motivated by craving always harms myself as well as others, I am determined not to engage in sexual relations without mutual consent, true love, and a deep long-term commitment. I resolve to find spiritual support for the integrity of my relationship from family members, friends, and Sangha with whom there is support and trust. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken by sexual misconduct. Seeing that body and mind are interrelated, I am committed to learn appropriate ways to take care of my sexual energy and to cultivate the four basic elements of true love: loving kindness, compassion, joy, and inclusiveness, for the greater happiness of myself and others. Recognizing the diversity of human experience, I am committed not to discriminate against any form of gender identity or sexual orientation. Practicing true love, we know that we will continue beautifully into the future.
This mindfulness training was updated because it used to say, I'm trying to think how the phrase was, a long-term commitment made known to my family and friends. And there was recognition that that is not always a happy thing for somebody to do, somebody that's just coming out. And so it was shifted, it's changed, so that there is more recognition that you might need support in other ways when you're going through something like that, when you're doing something like that. And just to point out that what we sang after the meditation is these 4 ways of giving us nutriment or supplying us with these loving qualities. Let's see. So there is my tree, metta. There is, I almost have to sing it to be able to say it. Karuna, which is loving kindness. Mudita, which is kind of joy. Joy for yourself and others. And then upeksha, which is inclusiveness. So when we have all of those things in our practice, we will have true love. I think we better move on so we have time to finish. The 4th mindfulness training. This one was really important to me in the beginning. I thought I was a good listener, but what I discovered is that I was already forming how I wanted to respond while I was listening. And that is not really deep listening. So I've learned, and hopefully I'm a better listener. I think I am. But there's always more to know. There's always more to learn. We can always get deeper. Our speech can always get more loving. Somebody want to read this one?
Can I read this? 4th mindfulness training. Loving speech and deep listening. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others, I am committed to cultivating loving speech and compassionate listening in order to relieve suffering and to promote reconciliation and peace in myself and among other people, ethnic and religious groups and nations. Knowing that words create happiness or suffering, I am committed to speaking truthfully using words that inspire confidence, joy, and hope. When anger is manifesting in me, I am determined not to speak. I will practice mindful breathing and walking in order to recognize and to look deeply into my anger. I know that the roots of anger can be found in my wrong perceptions and lack of understanding of the suffering myself and in other person. I will speak and listen in a way that can help myself and the other person transform suffering and see the way out of difficult situations. I am determined not to spread news that I do not know to be certain, not to utter words that can cause division or discord. I will practice right diligence to nourish my capacity for understanding, love, joy, and inclusiveness, and gradually transform anger, violence, and fear that lie deep in my consciousness.
Thank you, John. In the book that I'm reading from, Ty reminds us that we can practice loving speech in our writing as well. We communicate so much now by text and email, so it's even more important that we we pay attention to how we're writing something or what we're writing. And he says, when you write something and the person who is reading it can't see your face or hear the tone of your voice, it's even easier for them to have a misperception. It's very important that we write with mindfulness and the intention to use loving speech. I liked that because I have had that experience myself when I've received an email and I mistook it. It seemed a little curt or something, you know, and that was not at all the intention of the sender. So I liked his reminder that loving speech also has to do with what we write as well as what we say. Let's go on to the last one, and then we'll have plenty of time to for you to ask questions or clarify something you don't understand, whatever. So the last one is called Nourishment and Healing.
May I read this one?
Alex? Yes.
Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption, I am committed to cultivating good health, both physical and mental, for myself, my family, and my society by practicing mindful eating, drinking, and consuming. I will practice looking deeply into how I consume the 4 kinds of nutriments, namely edible foods, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. I am determined not to gamble or to use alcohol, drugs, or any other products which contain toxins, such as certain websites, electronic games, TV programs, films, magazines, books, and conversations. I will practice coming back to the present moment to be in touch with the refreshing, healing, and nourishing elements in me and around me, not letting regrets and sorrow drag me back into the past, nor letting anxieties, fear, or craving pull me out of the present moment. I am determined not to try to cover up loneliness, anxiety, or other suffering by losing myself in consumption. I will contemplate interbeing and consume in a way that preserves peace, joy, and well-being in my body and consciousness, and in the collective body and consciousness of my family, my society, and the earth.
Thank you, Alex. This training is very, it covers a lot of territory because it covers what he refers to as the 4 kinds of nutrients. What we eat, all of the impressions we get through all of our senses, that in itself is a big category. Volition, which is deepest desire, the things that we really want to achieve or do or think or whatever. And consciousness, which is in this understanding means how you're thinking, how you're being. So all of these things could, we could talk about each one of those separately for, like, I could do a Dharma talk about each one of them because it's very comprehensive. This is the kind of training that those of us who have taken them study. I'll just speak for myself, like Neil said. I still have insight when I read this and understand it more deeply. I've also noticed how it's begun to play, how it shows up in my life, being more careful about what I eat, being grateful when I'm able to go to the farmer's market and get food from the people who grew it. I'm grateful when I go to the supermarket, if there's stuff there that I want, to choose wisely and be grateful for the way that it got there. So all of those things are very different for me. It's not just about going somewhere and picking stuff up and consuming without acknowledging what's behind it, how it all got to me, for instance. The same is true for all of these other things. Sense impressions includes what we think, what we see, what we smell, what we taste, the people we talk to. All of these things are coming in through our senses. And I guess one thing that I have noticed is that I really cannot go into some places that are either way too noisy or kind of chaotic. I just have to avoid those kinds of places. And when I do go, like when I have to go to Sam's, I kind of steel myself, like put on a shield sort of and say, okay, I can do this because it'll be quick. And then, but I really appreciate that I can get all those, the things that I get there. So it's kind of, double-edged sword, but I don't go very often. There are other things like television shows and movies, that are just too violent. So, yeah, that's how it has affected me. Does anybody else want to speak to that before we?
All value. I think this fifth one is kind of the most challenging for me. And it's one of the more valuable ones because I need that challenge. I definitely cover up loneliness by watching TV or playing a game on the computer at times. But this is a nice reminder for me that like, maybe that's not the healthiest default setting. And I can choose to do that when I feel like it's appropriate, but I don't want to just sort of mindlessly like get swept away in that stream and stay there too long because that's not a healthy space for me. There's other parts of it that I don't understand that you spoke to a bit, but I still haven't quite digested. Like, what does consuming volition and consuming consciousness really mean? That's a confusing turn of phrase for me. So I'm still working on parts of that. And it's ironic because parts of this are easiest for me. It's like I'm very deliberate about what I eat and consuming foods that are healthy for me because I know when I don't, it's not worth it. Like I feel terrible and it's too heavy a price to pay. So it's a very easy part for me to stick to. It's become second nature, but other parts are like really challenging and it's process stuff I'm working.
So, any questions? We've covered a lot of territory, but do you have a question? Yes, Alex.
I'm Alex, following in. I was wondering in the second teaching, so climate change at the end, I was wondering when that was added to the teaching.
I think it might have been in that translation, that revision that happened in 1985. I know that Thich Nhat Hanh has been concerned about Earth, for a long, long time.
Quite vision of it.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, I guess. Do I stop recording before we talk?